Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Fox. I'm the former state's attorney for Cook County here in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm pleased to moderate today's discussion. The Institute for Innovation in Prosecution provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. And we are delighted to be hosting today's event, and we thank you so very much for joining with us today. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone here today as we engage in an important discussion on beyond criminalization, homelessness, and criminal justice, as we explore innovative responses to quality of life crimes and homelessness. Now, this webinar will focus on proven strategies that prosecutors and local government stakeholders can employ to scale back punitive measures that criminalize poverty rather than promote public safety. Over the past 2 decades, homelessness has become an escalating crisis across the United States. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development released their 2024 annual homelessness assessment report, in which it was found that the number of people experiencing homelessness on a single night in 2024 reached a record high of 771,480 individuals. Several factors have contributed to this, and we will talk about this in greater depth momentarily, including the unprecedented rise in or lack of affordable housing, rising inflation, stagnating wages for middle and low income families, and mental health challenges. Now, prosecution plays a key role in this, as those experiencing homelessness are often arrested and fined, and further trapping them in a cycle of poverty. These measures not only fail to address the root causes of homelessness, but also divert resources away from effective solutions like affordable housing and social services. So we'll explore the wide array of opportunities that prosecutors have to reverse the national trend toward criminalizing homelessness, with today's panelists discussing the current landscape of laws and enforcement practices that penalize homeless individuals for their presence in public spaces, while we'll also be exploring practical solutions for addressing site-specific challenges using the tools available to local prosecutors. Now, the best part, I get to introduce our panelists. However, in the interest of time, our panelists, I will introduce them very briefly. We'll place a link to each of their bios in the chat, and we encourage you to read about their experiences and accomplishments, but you will be excited to hear what they have to share today. Joining us today, we have Claire Herbert, who is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon. We have Mike Schmidt, my former colleague, who was the District Attorney of Multnomah County in Portland, Oregon from 2020 to 2025. We have Naya Kelly, who is the State Legislative Director for the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And we have Donald Whitehead Jr., who is the Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. Now let's start our conversation today by setting the stage. I've previewed some of the challenges that allow us to find ourselves here today, but I want to dig a little deeper into that context as we start to think about how we got here, what it looks like before we get to solutions. And so first, I'll start with you, Naya. What do you consider to be the most significant challenges or primary factors contributing to the persistence of poverty and homelessness here in Illinois?
Thank you so much, and I'm so excited to be here. I think in answering that question, it goes back decades, if not centuries at this point. We are seeing, lack of access to affordable housing, as you stated at the top, the stagnation of wages, and we haven't really invested in ensuring people have access to housing. I think in a conversation that I had a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the last time that the federal government truly thought about ensuring that folks had access to housing was during President Jimmy Carter's administration, and ever since then, things have continued to trickle down in terms of how we fund housing and urban development, how we look at the carceral system and engagement there. who do we deem deserving of housing and what barriers or what hoops people have to jump through in order to access services. So for my organization in particular, we are an advocacy organization working out throughout Illinois. And, I always say that homelessness is, despite our name being Chicago Coalition to End Homelessness, we know that homelessness is not just a city issue. We understand that it truly is something that impacts people in the suburban areas, rural areas, and it's seen across the state. Whether or not you see an encampment, to the on ramp of your interstate, or you see people in your downtown area, understanding that homelessness is not something that is always visible. It is not something that, you can always automatically say, oh, this person is experiencing homelessness. And then in terms of, seeking services for people who are experiencing homelessness, it is oftentimes I talked about, the hoops and barriers, but like even just getting into the front door or the foyer of our homeless and housing systems, it is, in a hearing I was at this morning with the Department of Human Services, they stated that of the people who call 311 looking to get into basic shelter, there's a 34% chance that there won't be shelter available for that person. And so that's often the first step someone goes into in order to receive housing services. And so at every turn, we as a society are failing people who are experiencing homelessness and people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for that, Naya. Donald, I want to turn to you. So, as Naya mentioned, she's got a perspective for the state of Illinois. You, on the national scale, what are some of the most pressing factors contributing to homelessness, and how are they connected to systems like the criminal justice system?
Thank you so much for having me, first of all. And Naya certainly pointed out some issues that are both local issues in Chicago, but national issues as well, the lack of affordable housing. So we have probably a 7 million gap in affordable housing available to people that need it. And the only place where we have that kind of gap is at the bottom of the economic ladder. So high-end housing is in abundance in the middle of the economic ladder. There's certainly enough housing, but not at the bottom of the economic ladder. In fact, there's nowhere in this country where you can afford a two-bedroom housing unit if you're working a minimum wage job or you're getting some kind of subsidized income. And only 10% of the country can you even afford a one-bedroom housing unit. So the housing wage in this country is about $22 an hour. The minimum wage, the federal minimum wage, is about 7. So you have to work the equivalent of 3 full-time jobs or have 3 full-time earners in order to in order to be able to afford housing. You talked about the increase last year, which was the highest in history. Last year was the highest increase in history as well. So over the past 2 years alone, we've seen a 30% increase in the number of people who are experiencing homelessness. And we've also seen a dramatic increase in the number of people who are homeless and unsheltered. And therein lies the problem with most people in communities that think criminalization is the response. Because people are seeing more and more people living in urban environments, in parks, on the sidewalk, in communities, people have come to believe, and it was a concerted effort to do this, that they're there because of a moral feeling. In fact, what Naya talked about is a structural feeling that has been in existence almost since the beginning of time in this country. We've actually had 4 periods of homelessness over the course of our history. This period is actually the longest period. And the reason why we haven't resolved it is we haven't had a federal response to meet the level of need in this country. So, and I'll unpack that a little further. We, the National Coalition, drafted the McKinney-Vento Act back in the late 70s, early 80s. It actually got passed in the early 80s. That is still the principal source of funding for homeless programs. And it was designed as a comprehensive response that would include additional housing production, minimum wage increases to the level of the increases that we see our CEOs have. But it was whittled down to an emergency response. And so that's what we have in this country. We have an emergency response to homelessness. We have programs that are extremely successful. We have the Permanent Supportive Housing Program, which includes housing along with supportive services, and that has a 90% success rate. But we have people who are actively involved in making that a negative program in our country. So there's a group of people who are well funded, moving to a substance abuse only system. And we know that there are people with substance abuse, but recent studies have shown that the majority of people don't have substance abuse issues. In fact, the largest growing sector of that growth in population was families with children. And so if you look at the National Education Association numbers, they note that there's about 1.3 million children over the course of the year that experience homelessness. So that number, that point in time number, is a terrible undercount. And that is another reason why we don't have the resources. People use that number as the baseline for how many people are homeless in this country, but the true number of homelessness is considerably higher. And so because of all of those factors, more people being seen, many communities have resorted to criminalization. This is following a Supreme Court decision in Oregon that made it legal to criminalize, meaning fine, jail, and arrest people if they are on public land in Oregon. And that opened the door. So now we have 159 plus communities that have enacted ordinances. And I could get into some of those. I know we'll talk about that a little later, but some of those are draconian at best. And we outlawed vagrancy laws in this country in the 70s, but we've actually gone back to the same practices in modern times. And it has had a definitely negative impact on the number of people that are becoming homeless and staying homeless, because saddled with fines or jails or criminal records, it makes the transition out of homelessness just that much more complicated for people. People can't get housing, they can't get jobs, and they cycle back into the criminal justice system.
Thank you for that, Donald. And you've laid a lot out there that I know that we'll be circling back to address. Particularly, thank you for highlighting, as I gave those numbers, which is an undercount, and I said individuals, but the appreciation for the context of that there are children among those, that there are families that are among those, that there's an aging population that is among those. And we'll talk about that further, but thank you for that context. I want to switch to you, Claire. How does criminalization of homelessness deepen the cycle of poverty? And we've heard Donald allude to that in the latter part of his remarks. But if you could give some context about what homelessness and how that impacts the increased cycle into poverty once the criminal justice system is involved.
Thanks, Kim. Also, I just want to say, Nan, you set the stage for this conversation so well by highlighting right off the bat, this is also about housing policy and this shift to seeing a dramatic increase in the number of people who are unsheltered. And that is exactly where I was going to sort of start some of these comments with. The criminalization of homelessness is becoming a more severe problem because we have so many people who are living unsheltered, which means that they are not living in temporary shelters, in any sort of transitional housing, in any sort of permanent supportive housing. Most of these folks are living in tents, vehicles, or other places not meant for human habitation, and they're spending a lot of time in public space because they have no private spaces to which they have legal access. So at that point, when we're talking about efforts to address unsheltered homelessness and sort of the public nature of homelessness, we see that criminalization efforts create a series of barriers for people trying to exit homelessness. We see that, in the near term and downstream, these interactions with criminal justice systems just make it harder for people to gain stability, to get housed. When they're living outside, getting displaced and moved around a lot, they're losing IDs, they're losing clothing, they're losing all their possessions, including medical equipment, medication. Folks who are in the house are getting frequently getting fined and ticketed, and we know that most of these people are unable to pay these fines, but yet it costs our systems a lot of money to issue them and process these citations. Um, when encampments are disbanded and folks are forced to move around, research shows that people are more likely to move to more dangerous spaces when there are these removals. They are also losing community bonds that exist among folks living in encampments, which provide important sources of social support. Moving people around then also makes it harder for social workers and other outreach workers to find them and continue providing medical, mental health, and just other sorts of services and help people get connected with housing. I mean, I've heard stories from outreach workers here in Eugene, Oregon, where like this person finally got on the top of the list. They're next in line for housing, and I can't find them because where I used to find them got that encampment got swept and they got moved. And all of this is also an incredible amount of work and time for folks who are living unhoused, and the labor that goes into trying to live outside, to trying to evade detection and interaction with police, creates it makes things like finding and staying employed really, really difficult for people. So this is just sort of this near term and downstream. It creates a host of obstacles when we try to respond to people who are living outside with various forms of criminalization.
Sorry, I want to stick with you for a moment. And so you express those challenges. Is there any evidence in your research that suggests that criminalizing quality of life offenses lead to better outcomes? As Donald alluded to, we're now seeing this explosion of ordinances across the country over the course of the last several years, and one might think that explosion is rooted in some research or data that suggests that criminalization practices lead to people not existing in those conditions. Is there anything in your research that would support that?
Great question. There is no evidence to suggest that responding to homelessness with sort of criminalizing efforts with by enforcing quality of life ordinances actually decreases homelessness, in large part because um, despite some popular perception, the vast majority of people who are homeless want to be housed. They don't want to be living outside. So they are not making active decisions to live outside. If they had other options, they would take them. So punishing people for being unhoused is essentially what we're learning is really just a waste of resources. We are funding efforts that end up perpetuating homelessness rather than funding efforts that would help resolve these situations. Um, and we have increasing research and evidence to suggest that other forms of like mobile crisis response um, that do not criminalize people who are living outside and other people who are experiencing sort of mental health crisis and things like that. That these mobile crisis response programs are really, really effective. And I could talk about that a little bit now or maybe later. That's better.
We'll circle back. Yeah, we'll circle back when we look at solutions. But I'm going to let you go in one moment. But you said something that I think is worth teasing out just a little bit. You said, despite people's perceptions that people want to live outside. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because we're going to, in our next series of questions, kind of undo a little bit of this. But this is a great setup for we see this explosion of laws. We have a lot of stakeholders who are on our call today looking for ways that they can be, supportive of the interest of public safety. But this issue around homelessness, and I'm going to ask our other panels, seems a bit difficult, largely around perception. Tell me when you said, what the misperception is about people who are out on the streets.
Definitely. Can you guys hear me a little bit better now? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right, some stupid headphones. So again, this kind of popular perception, this narrative or this term that actually circulates a lot in popular discourse is this idea of being service resistant. That folks who are unhoused, they don't want to interact with service providers. They don't want to take advantage of services that are being offered. And the research again shows that this is not true, despite the fact that every once in a while some people do encounter, folks living outside who don't want the particular services being offered to them at that moment. But what the research really shows is that a lot of the time the services we're offering are not a good fit for people's needs, particularly when we're talking about shelters. So a lot of communities have shelters that, for example, they're congregate shelters, which means, sometimes a couple of hundred people living in one big room. That is that's a traumatizing space for a lot of people. It's a very scary space to live in. I've talked to unhoused people who have significant health problems, and being in a place where so many people are sharing air constantly is exacerbating health conditions. So they can't live inside. They can't live in those kind of shelters. We know that a lot of folks are told that they can't stay with their partners if they want to go into a shelter because a partner, is men only or something like that. A lot of the time, also folks are told they can't bring their possessions inside with them, and so they're having to think about, or they're being asked to make a compromise between maintaining control and the security of all of their worldly possessions and sleeping indoors. We also have a lot of shelters that have sobriety requirements, and some folks are not there yet. A lot of people who are living outside self-medicate because they're not getting regular healthcare treatment, and so they're self-medicating with various substances. I also hear from a lot of women who are unhoused who actually start using methamphetamines to stay awake at night to protect themselves, so that they're not victimized. And so the reality then is that it's not about people wanting to be homeless. It's not about people refusing services. It's about the services that are available not being a fit for the needs that people who are unhoused have.
Thank you for that context. It's incredibly important. I will take a point of privilege to share a little personal background for me. When I was a junior into my senior year of high school, my family experienced homelessness for a period of about 6 months. And one of the big challenges for us in looking for shelter care was some of what you described. I have an older brother who, my mother was then challenged in finding a shelter that would take men. And even though my brother was 17 and still a minor, he was considered a man. And we were unable, in a lot of instances, to find places where we could be together. Ultimately, my brother went to stay with a family friend. But that challenge, the challenge as you describe of being in a congregate setting, as a child with my mother, I watched her stay up late at night, fearful for what would happen to me, or the restrictions that we would have in terms of when we had to come inside, and not be able to go back outside. And what did that mean for a 16-year-old girl who's trying to live a normalized life? And so those challenges are very real, and I appreciate your explaining that. But I also want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room before I get over to Mike and his experiences on the ground as a DA, which is the intersection of homelessness and race. And we know that this is a national issue, that as we described the context earlier, that this is an issue that hits all segments of our communities. But there is, as most things in our criminal justice system, there is this underlying tension related to race. And so, Naya, I want to bring you back for a moment and ask you about your thoughts on the connection between racial and social equity in Illinois and homelessness.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a huge topic, but I will round it down to a couple of talking points. One, I think someone mentioned around, the land that we are on here in Illinois, obviously stolen land. But in thinking about, the last couple, like thinking about the last 100 years or so, Donald talked about vagrancy laws and how those were set up as a way to criminalize Black people, and thinking about, how to feed into the criminal justice system and have folks laboring there. You also have to think about access to housing and redlining. I would say that Illinois is one of the worst offenders when we're talking about housing discrimination and segregation, looking at, we currently have a bill here in Springfield that would allow people to remove racial covenants from their deeds without having to pay a fee because people don't want that attached to their home anymore. And I believe there's a project that works on in Chicago that has you can look up to see if your home has that criteria. And speaking of covenants, and getting to Grants Pass, the Supreme Court case that brought us here together and and is exacerbating the issue around the criminalization of homelessness. Grants Pass was a sundown town. So 100 years ago, Black people were not permitted to live in Grants Pass. And saying that, we and for folks who don't know what sundown towns are, they're often spaces across the country. They're not just Southern. We have them all up and through Illinois as well, where Black people or people of color were not permitted after the sun went down. And saying, a sundown town, oftentimes that it's a 24-hour thing, but absolutely after dark. And there are newspaper articles from Grants Pass that's where people were asking if they could, they wanted to bring in Black people into the community so that they could have a service industry. So having people watching their children or cleaning their homes. And the decision from the higher ups in Grants Pass was like, absolutely not. Find someone white to hire. And I truly believe there is a through line between what we're seeing in terms of the criminalization of homelessness and issues with racism. A couple of municipalities prior to the Grants Pass decision here in Illinois decided to, pass ordinances under the guise of, oh, we had a migrant crisis here in Illinois. And that crisis was created as Texas and Florida was sending bus loads of migrants to the state. And we assisted in allowing folks to settle both in the city of Chicago and suburban areas. You saw this fright of the unknown and these stereotypes of who was coming into our communities. And and for people who are coming here who don't have work visas, who may not have access to housing yet, setting up a tent in certain communities, that meant that folks needed to find a way to police these folks out of their spaces. So there's absolutely a you cannot talk about homelessness without talking about race. And as my role within my organization is unique because I'm both the state legislative director, but I also work on our equity work. And in that, I get to say, we will not end homelessness until we end racism, because we will always find a way to subjugate Black people and people of color. And how, understanding that housing is one of our basic needs is often one of the things that people attempt to deny, and to keep out of reach for people of color, particularly Black people.
Thank you for that context. Um, Donald, was there anything you wanted to add on the national perspective related to this?
Sure. Just as Claire mentioned, there's a lot of research on this issue. My company, Racial Equity Partners, we actually work exclusively on this issue, and it does date back to the beginning of this country. Actually, the first federal policy that instituted homelessness that was racist in nature was the Indian Removal Act. The Trail of Tears, you may remember that. Many people were forced out of their homes. We also have the Great Migration, and Chicago's role in the Great Migration was restricted covenants. People thought they would come into a city with open arms, but they came into a city deeply segregated. And all of those issues are still impacting people today. So the wealth gap when it comes to the wealth between people of color and white people in America has been exacerbated by some of the housing policy that was federally intentional policy, like the VA loans that when Black servicemen returned, they were not able to get housing. They were not able to get the education benefits. You also have public housing that was intentionally segregated. You have Black public housing and white public housing. Now, people will say, well, that was so long ago. But really, we started to move into a more equal society. People use Brown versus the Board of Education. That was 1954. So we had 200 years of slavery. We had another 100 years of Jim Crow laws and other laws. And now, since 1954, we haven't had equality. I'll say that. And what Naya was talking about with restricted covenants, if you couldn't believe this, in many communities, they still exist today. And there's also a couple of other things that really have an impact on homelessness. One is that you can't discriminate, at least for right now. We don't know what the future holds because we've seen a pushback on a lot of these issues. The Fair Housing Law made it illegal to discriminate against somebody because of the color of their skin. However, you can still discriminate openly because of source of income. So if a person comes to you with a Section 8 certificate or a FASH housing certificate for veterans, you can say, I don't want that. And it can absolutely be discrimination, but you don't have to discriminate. You aren't outright discriminating against a person because of the color of their skin. You're using that source of income as a way to discriminate. And we still have zoning laws in this country that prevent the development of multifamily housing. Those are racially motivated laws. And until we get rid of those and start a mass production of housing, structural racism will always be an issue. African Americans make up 13% of the general population, 40% of the homeless population. It's even wider when it comes to Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. It's an 8-to-1 ratio for Pacific Islanders, their makeup of the general population versus how many people are homeless. So absolutely, as we've seen those people on the street, as we talked about, the number of people of color increase, we've also seen criminalization increase. And there's a direct correlation between the two.
Thank you for that context, truly. Mike Schmidt, we now get to you. I wanted to set up the context for what the universe looks like outside of the work that you and I did as prosecutors. And for our audience, which is made up by largely of prosecutors who get a file on their desk and maybe not have a deep appreciation of what led to that file coming to them. So, Mike, when you first took office as the DA in Multnomah County, what was the general perception of quality of life crimes in your jurisdictions, and how did these crimes impact communities and public policy discussions at the time when you came in 2020?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me. When I came in 2020, the conversation was a lot more aligned with some of the themes that Claire was bringing up in her research about, how do we get to the root causes? What can be the role of the criminal justice system? Portland's been dealing with homelessness for a long time now, but at least then it was more focused, at least the conversation when I was elected, more focused on problem solving. What I witnessed over my term, my 4 years, we had a thing happen. It was called the pandemic. Uh, that just really kind of laid bare. I mean, it broke, we all know it broke all of the social safety nets, and it also removed a lot of people off the streets in the public because they're working from home, they're quarantined in their houses. And what left behind was who didn't have those resources or those abilities to get off the streets. And what I've witnessed over the past now 5 years is what I'd characterize and others have characterized as a really big onset of compassion fatigue in the community, and just people saying, they're done with it. They're, whereas maybe towards the beginning of my term, they felt like, more charitable and wanting to get at these root causes to just wanting to get people out of the streets. And I think a lot of that has to do with some of the mythology that we've already touched upon, which is I hear things like, well, they're all using drugs. They're all service resistant. They're all committing crimes, right? I myself have done a bunch of outreach and volunteering over my years in Portland, walking around at 7 a.m., handing out coffee and hot chocolate and having conversations. And anybody that's done that work can tell you that that's just not the case. And some of the other things that were mentioned about our growing senior population on the street is a huge deal. Kids, and I've seen, in my reach and out in the community, I've seen people getting out of their tents and going to work, with their or going to school. Students going to school out of their tents, and so. Um, but that compassion fatigue is real, and so I'm going to be a little bit compassionate to my fellow prosecutors here. I think we're in a tough position. There is this trend towards criminalization. People have that fatigue and just want this issue resolved. And so there's a lot of pressure on prosecutors to be used as that tool to resolve this issue. But my, direction to my office when I was the district attorney, and what I would ask the prosecutors to, as they're having these conversations with community members, is to reorient the conversation to what is our goal? What are we trying to achieve? Because the arrest and criminalization of these types of crimes of people, living out in the streets. So you see trespass, you see, low level types of theft or harassment or things of that nature. What are we hoping to achieve with the criminalization of those issues? And frequently, all prosecutors and police officers, they know it's not actually going to help the situation to remove somebody from their belongings, remove them from their community, their pet, their dog, their loved ones, and then release them out onto the street, 2 to 4 hours later, sometimes right in the middle of the night with nothing. That actually doesn't help resolve any of these issues. And so I think prosecutors, I hope, have a mentality of problem solvers in our community, but I'm empathetic to prosecutors because we're in a tough position. A lot of people want us to use our tools in a heavy-handed way, not understanding that the criminal justice system does not have the solution for this issue.
Well, I want to stick with you for a moment because I'm getting a little bit of PTSD listening to you speak. Of having, run a large prosecutor's office in a jurisdiction that was grappling with these issues, and that sense of urgency from community of wanting to do something. When I go on my way to work to get my cup of coffee, I remember there was a man who was sleeping out front, and, his pants had come undone. And so he was exposed, and certainly not something that one would want to see. What our community doesn't want to have people living under those conditions, and then getting, the citation, then getting, that arrest. Tell me, Mike, when you came into office, right, that context all matters, but for our prosecutors on the call, all right, we've got an arrest now. They're
Yeah.
now brought to you. What was your office's approach in 2020, and what evolution did you see over the course of time in terms of that's happened? All of these things outside of our control, the social safety network, the lack of affordable housing, the stagnating of wages. And I think there's ways that prosecutors can convene on these issues. But all of those systemic failures that we've outlined over the course of the first portion of this end up at your desk. What
Yeah.
happens when they're at your desk?
Yeah, well, when I took over in Multnomah County in Portland, we had something called a community court. And I would describe that as a rocket docket, which was essentially, hey, just take accountability for being out on the street. And we'll dismiss this, or maybe just give you 8 hours of community service or 16 hours of community service or $100 fine, some sort of mitigated punishment, but like just agree to this really quickly and we'll just move this case through the system. So the community court, I think, was designed to resolve cases so they weren't clogging up the criminal justice system. It wasn't designed, I mean, it wasn't effectuating helping people. And I think at its inception, the hopes were that they would connect to services and things of that nature. But in reality, it was a mechanism for cleaning the dockets as fast as possible. So that was what it was when I started. I actually reached out to the Cooks County office to talk about some of the things that were happening there, the state's attorneys there. And what I took from that conversation ended up being our Access Attorney Program, which is our community attorneys. And what I learned from talking to you, Kim, and others around the country was that prosecutors can be partners with the nonprofit community. We can be embedded in community spaces. Because one of the things, again, if you get back to like, what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? I found, and I think any prosecutors would know, that folks who are living out on our streets are our most vulnerable population. And they don't have a lot of trust for systems, and they don't have a lot of trust for law enforcement. And so that's a problem when we want to hold other people accountable who are doing real harm. When you talk about rape and murder and trafficking and drug dealing and these things, if we don't have folks trusting law enforcement, we don't have witnesses. And so embedding prosecutors side by side in community spaces so that they could help people get expungements, they could help, dismiss fines and fees. If there were warrants for kind of these types of lower level crimes, we could dismiss them. That's how the practice evolved. That was the evolution during my tenure, was to see how can we kind of get out working with partners to decrease some of the barriers that my co-panelists have brought up that the criminal justice system puts into place that actually are counterproductive.
Thank you for that and the subtle shout out. What we were doing in Cook was, a system that I had inherited and continues, which is our community justice centers, which are embedded in communities, where we had prosecutors who work with community leaders and others on all of these issues. Right? We touched on it a little bit, and I'm sure we'll get back to it a bit. We've seen a rise in eviction rates over the course of the last several years post-pandemic. We've seen a lot of people who've been the subject of scams and fraud, and the accessibility to the prosecutor's office feels very far away. Most people feel like they can only engage once an arrest has been made. And so, one of the things that I encourage prosecutors' offices, big or small, to do is dedicate some folks who work directly with community to address these issues. I also want to put a finer point on the thing that you said, Mike, because it's so incredibly important that as we talk about using the power of the criminal legal system to address these issues, are we doing more harm than good in our response? We to take from the doctor's credo of first do no harm. The issue that we find, particularly with vulnerable communities, is that point of trust that if we are engaging in practices like taking people's things away, arresting them for a few hours and letting them go back into the community, and now they don't have their belongings. Now they are, lost connections to people who have been around them. They don't have the treatment that they need, is that they do lose that trust. And when they themselves then are subject to violence. And we know that there is a particular vulnerability to this community to be subject to physical violence or sexual violence. Um, that vulnerability that is often created by this chasm between law enforcement and them make them more vulnerable. So something that I really want us to think about as prosecutors is this in furtherance of public safety? That's question one. And question two is our response causing further destabilization or further vulnerability to an already vulnerable population? Donald, I want to talk to you. Mike talked about this, about community and law enforcement coming together. And there might be some question of like, well, what does that look like? Again, the prosecutors have large dockets. They've got a lot of work that they tend to. How does one develop a relationship with organizations to be able to have these kinds of conversations to come with solutions?
I love how Mike framed the idea that we have to look at what are we trying to accomplish here, because oftentimes we get somehow people get confused about our goal here. We certainly do not want people sleeping outside. We don't want people in encampments or on the sidewalk, but we know that the solution is not criminalization, because at the end of the day, criminalization doesn't solve homelessness. So the goal should always be to end homelessness. And Mike also talked about some very effective practices that are happening in communities around the country. There are homeless courts. There's courts for veterans, and there's courts for people with mental health issues. And those courts, even if it's to speed up people navigating through the system, it often results in lesser fines, because typically if people are homeless, they can't afford those fines and they just balloon. But I think there are certainly roles and ways that there can be a collaborative action in order to get to the goal of ending homelessness. You mentioned evictions. We certainly don't have enough representation for people going through the eviction process. So those are things that we can do that are upstream solutions, because what we lack is upstream solutions. So we need to get to people before they become homeless. And so often the eviction process is one of those steps along the way. So prosecutors, judges, lawyers can certainly assist in those processes. The veteran courts have been particularly successful in preventing veterans from ever entering a homeless population. But that does require the resources necessary to end homelessness, and that's housing production. And so I know one thing that we can do together is we can talk to our elected officials, those that are not prosecutors or judges. We can talk to the people who are actually making the decision that we should enact an ordinance that criminalizes people. So a prosecutor in front of a city council saying this is not the way to go, that we need to move in a direction that moves people towards stability and ending their homelessness, would go an incredibly long way to ending some of these practices before they even start. On the federal level, if we had a group of prosecutors like yourselves coming to the table when we're talking to federal legislators, there isn't a federal criminalization ordinance. It doesn't happen at the federal level. It really happens at the local level. But we certainly could potentially get something to combat the Grants Pass case at the federal level. But we need the help of prosecutors. I myself have been involved in one-day courts where people experiencing homelessness in a shelter can get their charges expunged. They can do community service at that shelter. And those kind of things really remove some of the barriers, because President Clinton put into effect rules that make it illegal to use subsidized housing if you have a criminal record. It's really incredibly complicated to get a job if you have. There was a study in Osceola County, Florida. There were 37 people. They were arrested 1,375 times. It cost the city $6 million. So those kind of communication, those kind of statistics being communicated to elected officials in collaboration really will go a long way. So I think the courts, the specialized courts are very effective, but I think advocacy from the prosecutor's office to ensure that criminalization practices aren't enacted would really, really go a long way. And we've seen police officers do this. We've seen police unions do this. So we need prosecutors to be at the table as well.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go back to you for a moment, Mike, because I feel like you did do that. And where you were, when you talked about this a little bit on, the compassion fatigue. And as you were elevating and amplifying these issues, the stubbornness of the problem, because again, our solutions are not scaled enough to meet the need. Can you talk about what then happens when you have that tension with community, when you are trying to be innovative in an encouraging way to our folks, Mike?
Oh, in
And
an encouraging way.
yeah, but the reality of it and the collision with, yes, I hear that. And
Yeah.
how did that impact how you were able to do your job at the end of your term?
Yeah, thank you. And I was kind of smiling a little bit. Kim knows my story pretty well. By the end of my term, there were billboards all over Portland about how essentially homelessness was my fault. The DA was refusing to do this type of work, and that's why there was homelessness. And was not reelected, and my opponent ran on a tough on crime, no crime too small platform. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of the dissolution of some of the solutions that we put in place already here in just a few months. So it's challenging. It's really challenging, but I think, what people are frustrated, the compassion fatigue is real. Kim, exactly what you described. I mean, when I take my kids to school, you see somebody who's openly using drugs on the street, you don't feel safe. And so people want resolution to those things. And I understand that. But I think what is missed and is being sold to people is the criminal justice can solve this problem. But what's missed is what actually happens, right? The arrest happens. The person is removed from all of their stuff. They will be released within hours with nothing. They will be actually set back. If they were working in either with their medical professionals and were getting treatment, I talked to one man who had a bone growth stimulator that he finally got through the health plan, the Oregon health plan, only to have his tent swept in this thousands of dollars machine thrown into a dumpster. And he just looked at me and he said, "You're crazy. What are you doing?" And because, of course, I represent the state, right? So the state got him a bone growth stimulator for thousands of dollars. The state then came and took it and threw it in a dumpster. Like, how irrational does that seem to somebody who is trying to survive on our streets? And so, I think it's the community. I think people are sometimes being sold for political reasons and others that this can be a solution, but it's because they don't actually understand what really happens. There is no bed for this person to go into. There is no drug abuse or treatment. Our wait times for getting access to treatment are months long. And so the idea that you can arrest somebody and that gets them into treatment is mythology. It doesn't exist. And same thing with housing and other things. So I think it's a tough position that prosecutors find themselves in because people want a quick fix. They don't want to see this. At the end of the day, they want to feel safe in their community, and they have the right to do that. But they need to understand what the reality of what actually happens when somebody comes in the criminal system and how that actually sets everything backwards, not forwards.
Thank you for that, Mike. And I do appreciate that you were fearless in taking on these issues and having the honest conversation. What I will say to our prosecutors who sign up to do these incredibly difficult jobs, that we are meeting people at all times at the worst moments of their lives, and that fear and tension is very real. And then also having the courage to say that the thing that I've been tasked to do may not make it better. And so I alluded to this earlier of the do no harm piece. And so I want to go back to you, Claire and Naya, to get you back into the conversation. We get the file, we do everything that we're supposed to do, right? And so this is not a nuts and bolts primer on how to prosecute a trespass case. Oftentimes, these are some of our easiest cases for our prosecutors on the call. They're very easy to prove. Was our defendant in a place that he was not given permission to be in? Yes. Do we have a witness? Can we prove, like, these are easy wins, right? Let's acknowledge that. So these are cases that we can, as prosecutors, try every day, all day, and be successful at. Is our success in getting the win making our community safer, or are we destabilizing more? And so I want to talk to you, Claire, because you talked about it a little bit, and we've heard bits and pieces of this, but talk about that impact of that conviction. You mentioned it a bit, but I want to highlight again for our prosecutors who are able to get the win. We're able to try these cases. We're able to do this. Now, what? Is it making us safer? You said already no, but I want to, if you could, Claire, just like pinpoint what that conviction that we easily secured now is doing.
Right, right. I think that sort of a presumption that's undergirding the idea that that conviction is going to have a positive impact here is the idea that what we need to do is convince people that they should not be engaging in whatever behavior, loitering or trespassing or, I don't know, camping outside, having open containers, whatever it is, that if we punish them for this in some way, that it's going to change their behavior. The issue is these folks don't have an alternative. They don't even have a place to go to the bathroom that does not violate some sort of ordinance. Folks don't have a place to sleep without violating some sort of ordinance most of the time. And so the impact then is just this kind of ripple effect for them of a series of added burdens and hardships. It is, now I have uh, fines building up. I've been arrested and I've had my things taken and I don't have an ID. I don't even have a driver's license. How are you can't do anything without a form of ID anymore. Um, you've lost your birth certificate. You've lost the uniform that you wear to work, right? So now you can't go to work, or you're late for your job because you were picked up for a couple hours, whether or not you were actually booked, right? You're removed from your daily life for a while, and now you've lost your job because you didn't show up to work. And if what we want is for people to be able to exit homelessness in the very sort of near term, we need to do no harm, like you said, Kim. We need to stop making it harder for people to stabilize, to sort of get control of the various, sort of obstacles that they're facing in their life. And we need to have places for them to go, right? We need to have housing available. And there's a concept, another sociologist named Josh Symes has this concept he calls burden shuffling. He says what we're doing, these various kinds of, he's talking specifically about ambulance workers, but these various forms of sort of these emergency response and public safety systems are shuffling people around spaces throughout the city through different institutions. It might be that, the ambulance picks up someone because there's a welfare check and they were concerned about someone, and then they transport them to the ER. And then the ER releases them because there's nothing they can do. And then they're, in trouble for loitering, and the police pick them up and move them over to this other. And it is this sort of spatial churning that's happening around our cities, through our institutions, and it's incredibly costly. And this is why our current approach is funding the perpetuation of homelessness, not its resolution. Because what we need is for these interactions with institutions to connect people with housing, with treatment, with medical care. And if that's not at the end of those interactions, then it is leaving people worse off in the moment and compiling on burdens for them.
Thank you for that. You touched on what Donald had alluded to earlier with the study in Osceola that we know in our jurisdiction, and I wish I had a more articulate term for it, like our frequent flyers, that there's a population of folks that we see both in the criminal legal system and in our public healthcare system, that if they're not jailed, they're at our public hospitals. There is this population that we know have these coexisting issues that aren't being addressed at the hospital or the jails, and we do this shuffling and triaging in the moment, as opposed to thinking more forward about what happens next. Naya, I want to talk to you for a moment. One of the things too, and it was alluded to earlier, and I just want to amplify it again for our folks who want to do the right thing for what I will call these easy wins. It,
Hmm.
if we are incredibly successful in now we've located housing for you, we've located services for you, but you got that conviction on your record,
Yeah.
that happened in order to get that. In order for the second, third, all of the things that have happened, the third chance that you've gotten, all of those things, we know about the collateral consequences of convictions, but I want to talk about it anyway.
Yeah.
The collateral consequence for the individual that is housed is very different than the collateral consequences for those that are unhoused. Can you talk about
Absolutely.
that, please?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of places that we see that and can focus in on the housing space. So right now in Illinois, we're attempting to move a piece of legislation to ensure that these municipalities aren't able to create these ordinances that criminalize life-sustaining activity. But one of the things that we've talked about is if someone, and with these ordinances, the way that they're set up here, because it's motto language put out through our municipal league of, okay, on your first offense is $75 and it steps up to $750 that you can get in a 7 day period over 365 days. So if I'm sleeping outside for 7 days straight, I can rack up to $2,500 worth of fines because of 75, 150, and stepping up until it gets to 750, then I'm arrested.
Can I stop you for one moment? I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
Because I just want us to think about this for a second.
Yeah.
I find
Yes, say
you
it.
why not? I find you living outside unhoused. My presumption will be, we talked about some of the presumptions that other people have. You don't want to be
Yeah.
housed, you have a drug
Yeah.
addiction, you have all the, but my first thought is you don't have money. It's so that's
Mine
my
too.
first thought, is that perhaps because there's a better, I being in the elements, being subject to folks being in your like
Hmm.
that money might help you. So adding fines,
Yeah.
escalating fines, compounding fines, um,
Hmm.
does not seem like a logical response.
That
Secondarily,
is correct.
because we know we're not going to get it, right?
And
I'm just, the
you're
former
never
former
going to
prosecutor.
see it.
We're not recouping that money. And the cost
Yeah.
that we're actually expending to prosecute, to go to ticket the resources available for a proposition in which we know we're not going to recoup our dollars for. It's just something that I just want to highlight to folks when we talk about the win, at what cost? Because
Hmm.
we're not going to get those dollars back. And a strategy that uses fines and fees on a population that we know is in poverty is just tomfoolery at its best. So I apologize for
Yes.
interrupting, but I just think
No,
it's
that's okay.
saying
I really
that.
appreciate you drawing that out because you say it to people and you think that there must be something wrong with you to say that this seems like unconscionable. That who would think to put this into writing and then actively vote yes, a majority of people on a city council or a village board of some sort. But in fining people up to upwards of $2,500, when that person does find housing, and Claire talked about this, when people are on waiting lists, If we are pushing them out of encampments, if we're pushing them into unsafe spaces, oftentimes their case manager can't find them. But if they're lucky enough that all of the stars align and there's a housing opportunity and they have found a unit, that landlord is going to want to do a background check. And that landlord is going to see that you have multiple fines and arrests and tickets, and they're going to be able to see what it is for, and that it was for, experiencing homelessness. So it's like this double, it's this, maybe a Venn diagram or a complete circle of both civil and criminal coming together, because we talk about when someone's evicted, like what that means for their future opportunities to find housing. But if you're experiencing homelessness publicly and are now fined because of it, that landlord sees that you haven't been able to maintain housing and that you've been criminalized for that homelessness. I'll also just speak to one point. Sorry, Mike. One point I'll just speak to is that, and talking about this in subpopulations, and Donald brought up families, so the work that we do is, not isolated into, like, homelessness is not this like vacuum. You have people who are experiencing domestic violence, who are leaving dangerous situations and may experience homelessness because of this. So we are telling survivors of domestic violence, if you go to sleep in your car and you're there for 2 hours, we can ticket you.
Mhm.
So what?
Yeah.
I'm weighing whether the possibility of being fined in a child protective call because I'm sleeping in my car with my children, or staying somewhere where I am not safe. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
I just want to crystallize and put an exclamation on what you said, because how many of us as prosecutors or police officers have seen a person who gets ticketed for whatever this is, and the reaction of that individual is to crumple up the ticket and throw it away because they don't care, right? Because they're like, find me all you want. They see how
Right.
ridiculous that is. So you're like, find me, make it $1 million fine. We might as well, as long as we're doing, hilarious things, like let's really go for it. Because it's pointless, right? And to Claire's point, like they understand at an innate level, like punishing them for not having money by extracting money is the height of stupidity. But what it gets at and what happens, Naya, and you said this, and I just want to put it there, is that when that person gets back on their feet, what happens? Those fines come back. Now the checks are getting garnished. Now they can't get the job. Now they can't. So the very thing that the system says, oh, we really want this person to be off the street. We really want them to get back on their feet. We want them to get a job, right? When they actually do that, that's when the fines come back. That's when it hits them, not when they're experiencing homelessness and are completely insolvent and can't. It's later when they are actually, and I've seen it over and over and over again, as my office has literally forgiven tens of thousands of dollars of fines on people who have done the hard work to get themselves back in those spaces. And it's just so frustrating to see that the penalty doesn't happen when they're homeless, it happens when they're successful.
Thank you for that. And panelists, feel free to jump in. Donald, I see you've come off mute. Go for it.
Well, first of all, I want to go back and just thank you and Mike for your efforts, and really disappointing that the community doesn't see the value in those efforts, and how cities are better when people are housed, point blank. Um, but I also wanted to talk about just another issue. Some of this gets really extreme because we also have seen in those encampment raids people actually be killed. That just happened in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago. People were nearly killed in Washington, D.C. So it's just so dangerous to the people in so many different ways. We talked about the special populations. We didn't talk about the LGBTQIA plus population. And the other part of this is sometimes it does result in jail. And these are some of our most vulnerable citizens. And when they're in a situation where they're incarcerated, they become victimized even more many times. The other thing that I think we haven't talked as much about is where you can help. And certainly, I don't want anybody to lose their position or be ostracized in society because they've done the right thing. But we have to figure out how we change that narrative. What we're talking about today, everybody in America should be listening to and hearing, because the narrative has shifted. We used to be a compassionate community around homelessness. Now there's a contempt for homeless people. And the only way we can change that is if we change the narrative. That one, first of all, these are human beings. We're not talking about statistics. We're talking about human beings. And secondly, criminalization, as we've said over and over again, doesn't solve homelessness. So what does? And that's housing. And as I said, the permanent supportive housing program, and I will say this, many of the people that are street homelessness are the very kind of most complicated individuals with the highest barriers. So a lot of other people are doubled up. They may be more functional. So what we need is we need more treatment facilities for behavioral health issues, for substance abuse issues, and we absolutely need housing and services. I mentioned that the permanent supportive housing program, a program which was decided on because of the cost in society, from emergency rooms to mental health units to the law enforcement. That's why we came up with that program. It has a 90% success rate. People should be rooting for this. People should be doing op-eds about it. So whatever we can do individually in our sphere of influence, whatever that is right now, to change the narrative, I think that's the key to doing, to making some productive movement on this issue, is to really change the narrative in the ways that Claire's talked about, in the ways that Mike and you have talked about. And I'm passionate about this, and Kim, a point of personal privilege, I experienced homelessness twice. As a youth, I experienced homelessness with my family and also as an adult. And so I know what it feels like to be sprayed with a water hose at 4 in the morning. So what we're talking about is real, and it's about human beings. And I just want to make that point.
Thank you, Donald. I appreciate that. We are closing in on our last 15 minutes. We certainly want to invite the audience to ask questions during the course of the last 15 minutes. So please, if you have a question, get to typing in the chat while I set up our next point of conversation, and we'll get to your questions as they come. We're gonna shift to solutions. We spent a lot of time talking about where we find ourselves. And again, recognizing our audience, I'm hearing in the solution space, collaboration with other stakeholders outside of the criminal legal system, particularly engagement around the issues of housing and healthcare, mental health care, economic development, all of these things that feel outside of our sphere of influence. What I'm hearing is that we need to be able to work on those particular issues. I also want to point out that as we talk about the criminalization of homelessness, and it's been an underlying theme here, it's not just the vagrancy laws. I mean, Mike talked about it a little bit. It's also the theft laws. In Cook County, I got a lot of attention around the work that we were trying to do on low-level retail theft. And I want to be abundantly clear, I don't condone people stealing from our retail merchants and the impact that it has on local businesses. Particularly in Chicago, we've seen communities on the South and West Side, which have large populations of people of color, a large segment of people who are living below the poverty line, where we now have pharmaceutical deserts, where stores have closed up, and we have our elders who are unable to go get prescriptions filled because businesses have felt that it's not worth sustaining in those communities. And so there's a real appreciation of that. But it's also, when we talk about this issue of homelessness, we were seeing a lot of people stealing things like soap, a lot, stealing things like shampoo, stealing food. And in our notion of, in Illinois has one of the lowest thresholds for retail theft in the country. It's $300 to be tried as a felony for retail theft in Illinois. And again, you might be looking at that file, prosecutor, that's on this call, as simply a retail theft file, and not who is this person that we've arrested? And again, the compassion isn't that we excuse the behavior, but it is I can get this. Again, retail theft is another one of those cases that are really easy to prove. But if I have a defendant that doesn't have an address, if I have a defendant that is not going to be able to go back to a home, what am I doing here? What is the response even with the retail theft? Fine, we charge it. Is it a diversion program? Is it some type of other programming like specialty courts that you might not even be thinking about for retail theft? But these cases of criminalizing poverty don't just show up because someone is living in a tent. Um, Again, we're talking about people who are living, largely part of this conversation are people who are living outside, but as was alluded to earlier, people doubling up, couch surfing. When we were homeless, it meant we didn't have a home. I did sleep on couches. I did have those other issues. We were hungry. I did take things from stores to feed myself. That's real. And we want to be able to make sure that that context is there. I want to get to some questions in the chat. And it looks like Naya has touched it in the Q&A, but I'm doing anyway. Do any of you have any concerns that problem-solving courts, such as homeless courts, could lead to further criminalization of poverty rather than addressing people's underlying needs? And as was alluded to earlier, problem-solving courts have exploded over the course of the last 2 decades. My personal take is that the scale continues to not meet the need. Prosecutors' offices, again, I'm outside of them now, in the effort to make sure that we have success rates in problem-solving courts, do a lot of cherry picking to be able to get the results to show that our programs work. And sometimes they simply don't. But that's where we find ourselves. So I find this to be a really interesting question. So I'll go to Mike and Naya to get your thoughts on this. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I do have this concern. I was just listening or I was reading an article, another prosecutor in Oregon was being quoted, and he said, well, about half the people fail in our treatment court and about half of them succeed. So that tells me that we have really gotten it just right. I thought 50% failure rate tells you you've gotten it just right. Like, I hate sports metaphors. I hate governing by sports metaphors, 3 strikes, all that's nonsense. And this idea that a 50% failure rate means we've dialed it in is absurd. I think that treatment courts have a lot of opportunity. A lot of good can be done there. But if you start piling on things that are barriers to success, like showing it could be, we expect you to get across town, which you're going to have to switch 6 buses to get to this specific treatment provider, which is the one that the court works with. And if you don't show up there on time, they shut the doors and turn it away. And that we're going to count that as a failure. Like, you really have to be mindful as a prosecutor of what are the requirements? Are those realistic? I'd say speak to your participants in an honest way and be willing to accept their feedback about the challenges. Like, there should be expectations that people engage in things, and especially if they've committed crimes, right? Like, that is fair to expect that, but we need to make sure that the burdens aren't so high in treatment courts that we're setting 50% of the people up for failure and then saying, well, I guess we've got it dialed in just right.
Thank you, Mike. Naya, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna type into the chat. I had jury duty a couple of months ago, and it was at our criminal court 26 in California, and I live in Rogers Park. So anyone who knows Chicago, I am going from this part of the city to this part of the city, and thinking about people being able to navigate that. And I've heard pushback of like, well, we provide people with bus cards in order to meet their needs, but they may use that bus card or they may barter that bus card for their more immediate needs. And I think oftentimes, people will make judgments about people who are experiencing homelessness or experiencing poverty and the choices that they make in order to survive day to day. So, I put into the chat that I've heard from folks that there is a struggle with specialty courts just because it feels like they're under a microscope. And I love what you said, Kim and Mike, around, oftentimes these specialty courts may be under-resourced. And if you're bringing in a service provider, is that service provider, do they have everything in their toolkit? Like, are they going to be able to provide permanent supportive housing? Are they going to be able to assist this person with getting food access? Because if it's still, we may have one thing, or we can put you on a wait list, successfully completing that can still be very daunting for someone who is in that situation.
Thank you for that. So looking at a couple of questions, and in the interest of time, I'm going to collapse a couple. Colleen wants to know, do I or do we think that a solution would be changing the definition of a quote win in the minds of prosecutors? Is a win getting a guilty, or is a win trying to get someone out of the criminal justice system? I'll take a point of privilege because this is really important to me. I think the what we've been trying to say all along is this in the interest of public safety? Like I think that is the baseline question that you should be asking yourselves. And anything that you do as a prosecutor, is what I'm doing in furtherance of public safety? And if you start there, that kind of shapes how you move with the resources and tools that you have. Um, if we recognize that a lot of the folks that we have who are coming into our system have these underlying challenges and that the root causes that got them there aren't being met, is the win, the conviction, going to better serve us? And I know that there's a like, well, what do I do? I can't do nothing, right? The shop owner has called me multiple times. I have a constituency that says that I must do something. And I think that's where we have to get creative. That is where, as was alluded to earlier by our panelists, stepping outside of our traditional roles as prosecutors. And we talk about problem solving courts. You should be a problem solving prosecutor. Who are the people in our community that have the resources to address these issues, who have a level of scholarship and understanding like Claire does, or like Naya and Donald do, that can say, hey, I've got this recurring issue. What is it? Is it a lack of beds? Is it a lack of treatment? And what can I do? What are the resources that you have to be able to help us do that? Um, you have to start thinking again, what is the ultimate goal? One of the other questions that we had is, about bringing in social workers into offices. I think it is critically important to have someone with that level of expertise working in prosecutors' offices, because these issues are complicated. And because, as someone also wrote in the questions, your victims and your witnesses are having these same challenges. We're talking about criminalizing folks, but also your victims who are unhoused, your witnesses who maybe had a home when this case started that is now no longer there. And how do you engage with them? Having that level of expertise in your office, even a small office, I think has a longer term benefit for your survivors of crime. And so, what I would argue to the person who asked the question of how do you make that argument to your budget person, to the people who you work with, is that these issues, cite the numbers, the explosion in homelessness over the course of the last couple of years, coming out of the pandemic, the explosion in the eviction crisis. Your victims, the people for whom you are serving, are directly impacted by these issues. And having someone with subject matter expertise working on these issues gets you better outcomes for your taxpayers. So we've got 5 minutes left, and it's been a lot that has been said. So we're going to do a few last minute points from our panelists about solutions. If you could tell our prosecutors or other stakeholders in law enforcement or in community engagement who are on this call, a takeaway that can help them be more thoughtful about this work and proven solutions to be able to arm them for their work. And so I'll start with you, Donald.
Sure. So one of the things I saw in the questions, I think, is the answer. The question was, how do we should we change the of when. And I think, Kim, you've said that a couple of times. I think we really need to change the definition of when. As a prosecutor, as a judge, it's not just about winning the case, it's about winning for the community. So whatever ways that people can find to do that, they should do it. And certainly there has to be a simultaneous increase in resources, housing production, and the increase in changing that definition for it to work.
Thank
In
you.
the interest, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Claire.
Thanks. It's my favorite part, talking about solutions. So one, I want to piggyback really quickly on the idea of hiring a social worker. You can cite the research. The research shows that folks in service provision, outreach, et cetera, social workers are far more successful at connecting folks with resources because they have a history of establishing trust with vulnerable communities who have experienced a lot of trauma in the criminal justice system. I also want to talk more a little bit building on the issue of public safety, right? If that's one of our primary goals, there are a growing number of alternative mobile crisis programs. Cahoots here in Eugene, Oregon is the oldest model in the country, although it's facing some obstacles right now. But these programs have now been around long enough that we have program evaluations and research showing, one, that they are able to divert quite like high percentages of calls from police. There are some concerns about, calculating diversion rates and things like that. Some researchers at University of Oregon have been studying that very carefully. But these programs are also showing that they are preventative of low-level crimes. So Denver's STAR program and Eugene's Cahoots, there's now data that shows that when these mobile crisis response teams are operational, that low-level crime, nonviolent crime is dropping. The other point that I often like to highlight is the role of our community members, right? Because you all are dealing with police officers, for example, are responding to calls and complaints by typically housed residents. And I think that maybe prosecutors could play a role in pushing back against community members who see the police as the resolution to these sort of quality of life problems that they're experiencing in their communities. And if community members want to be participating in solutions, then they need to not be voting against affordable housing production in their communities. They need to be not voting against limits on Airbnbs and short-term rentals that are taking up our housing stock. They need to stop opposing putting shelters in their neighborhoods and communities. Those are the kind of things that are going to lead to more solutions versus constantly calling the police and expecting the police to solve all of these problems.
Thank you, Claire. Excellent points. Naya.
Yes, everything everyone else has said. Also, I will zoom out a lot and talk about our state and local budgets. I think, and how we bring revenue into our communities. We know that we have never truly funded housing and homeless and services in the time that we have created them. I think making sure that we understand that it does not take 5 minutes to, like, even if we end up getting fully funding these services, it is not going to take 5 minutes for us to turn this ship around. And so it is both doing advocacy around making sure that we are putting at the, whatever we can do in our roles, whether it is a prosecutor or it's a community member, making sure that we're pushing for additional revenue in our state budgets to work on homeless and housing services. The second thing I will say, Mike touched on already, but we had a community here in Illinois that was looking to pass one of these ordinances that in response to Grants Pass. Their chief of police went to their city council meeting and says, I don't want this. I don't need this to do my job. And so please do not pass this. And it went down in flames. And so stepping out and saying, this is not how we need to do our work, because you won't have to prosecute a case if there is no law telling you to prosecute it. And so like that is a win. And Kim, and it's so hard for me to call you Kim, but I'm doing it because I'm like honor like I like the honorariums. So but I remember when you first started as our state's attorney and someone told me that you were redefining what wins mean for people in your office. So I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you did and the legacy that you have created here, and saying we don't have to just tick the box and say that we got the guilty verdict. That is a win. What else? Like what else?
Thank you for that. And then I'm going to close with Mike, who fought the valiant fight as a prosecutor and now works for the Urban League of Portland, addressing these issues. And so Mike has the unique vantage point of the inside outside game on this work and is working directly on the issue of housing. So, Mike, what are your words as someone who's been a prosecutor having to deal with these issues and now someone in the advocacy space?
Yeah, thank you. So, first and foremost, I got three quick points. Reorient the goal. I say, ask yourself as a prosecutor, why? Why are you doing this? Kim said, do no harm. Both same, right? So I think reorient that. Second, one of my regrets as the elected DA is as the elected, you have a microphone. Use it for housing. Housing is public safety. And I had this thing where I was like, oh, this is my lane. My lane is criminal justice. My lane is this. No, you need to be out there advocating, making a lot of the points you've heard on this as the elected. And finally, as thank you for shouting out the Urban League. I'm so excited to be joined as general counsel. Lean in to your local nonprofits and communities who are doing this work. I mean, we are on the front lines at the Urban League. I couldn't be more excited to have joined them, more proud. We have a no wrong door philosophy. You come to the Urban League and we are going to make sure that we get you what you need. And if that's early childhood education for your kids, if that's workforce development, if that's homeless and housing and wraparound services. And so join your local Urban League and look to, the organizations that are doing this work and see how you can support them.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you to all of our panelists. I want to say, again, this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. We started this conversation about narrative. And I need for those of you who are on this call as prosecutors, but more importantly, as people, that this issue is closer to you than you think. When people see me and don't know that I understand how the shelter system has worked because I lived it, that your children are going to school with other children who are unhoused. You are likely working in an environment where someone doesn't have a place to lie their head. And so this notion of compassion fatigue that is real, that I've seen bear out, that it is us versus them, that those people are impacting our quality of life. I would remind you that these are people, these are humans, that there's a significant senior population who is suffering under the weight of homelessness, that there are children, that there are people who right now, as you know, our country is finding itself where people are being laid off on a regular basis. For those of you who are on this call, who are young prosecutors and know that you're living check to check and a student loan bill, and something can happen that can find yourself in this situation as well. You cannot be distant from this work. You cannot be distant from this issue. So get in where you fit in. If that's as a line assistant, talking to your supervisors about ways to be creative in the disposition of a case and your definition of a win. But more importantly, as a member of the community that can support organizations like the Urban League, that can support organizations like the Coalition for the Homeless, that can support research that is being done to help us frame how we want to live in society. That more than just being a prosecutor, you are your brother and sister's keepers. And that underlies everything that you should be thinking when you walk into that office with that suit. That helps you frame the question of what am I doing? Is this in the interest of the good? So I want to thank you all. I want to thank our incredible team at the IIP, to Noah and Harry, and to our intern who put this together, Layla, who brought together these exceptional panelists and the subject matter to bear. We're really proud of you, Layla, for doing this. And for those of you who are out there as students who don't believe that you can have a real impact, look at Layla and get involved, get busy. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you at the next webinar.